Thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for calling. I'm excited to present on my PhD project, which I've temporarily titled From Rust Belts to Microchip Valleys, Innovation Policy for Regional Revitalization. As Paul already said, I am here at the Technical University of Munich, where I'm at the STS Department, Science Technology Studies, and I'll explain what exactly that means in a minute. I'm Marlise Horvath Schneider, so let me take you on my journey. To introduce my research, so I started this project with the idea to study what my chair called quote unquote lost regions of innovation, which we equate very much with Rust Belt regions. And some of the descriptors of Rust Belt regions are post-industrial regions that face common issues of depopulation, shrinkage, brain drain, economic downfall, and have a reputation of being left behind. Some of you might be familiar with post-industrial regions from your own home countries. In Germany, this is the Ruhr region, which was a former mining region. In the United States, this is commonly the Midwest, where we had a lot of coal and steel. And when these mills were kind of, taken out of the energy creation, then they didn't have anything to replace them. So these places have, quote unquote, rusted and become left behind from more innovative and economically successful places. Policymakers are challenged with how to rescue these regions and how to bring them into the future, how to provide them a future. And that's what I'm really interested in. So one of those solutions is to put what's called innovation policy in place for regional revitalization. What that means most of the time is replicating the Silicon Valley model and creating silicon somethings or something valleys. The Silicon Valley model, if you're not familiar with it, is this idea of bringing together public and private institutions, usually through public funding in the form of tax cuts or incentives for private companies, and very importantly, involving the university within this partnership. So it would look something like a university working hand in hand with a company to create more innovation funded by federal or state or regional funding. So what happens when innovation policy is used for regional revitalization is something that my supervisor, Professor Dr. Sebastian Pfotenhauer, has dubbed the deficit model of innovation. So very often places are told, especially places that are post-industrial, that in order to come into the future, in order to have a desirable future, and in order to make a place worth living, it requires more innovation. And what this does is create an imperative. So places must be innovative. And this goes hand in hand with the public deficit model of understanding, which he calls the deficit model of innovation in this case. And that means that places are told that the reason that they have issues, like the ones I mentioned above, is because they lack innovation. And the only thing that will solve these problems is more innovation. So this is where my research becomes really interesting. This is actually a trend that's happening all over the world. This idea that innovation policy can be put in place to revitalize places that have been left behind. So these initiatives try to transfer the Silicon Valley model I explained before to Rust Belt regions. And you can see in this book, The Smartest Places on Earth, why Rust Belts are the emerging hotspots of global innovation. This is quite trendy. This is an idea that goes beyond policymakers through academia, entrepreneurship, this idea that you can take places that have been left behind to bring them into the future with innovation. One of these examples is the more recent US Chips and Science Act. So I started my research in 2021, and the US Chips and Science Act was passed in 2022. So it was really interesting timing for me. And what the US Chips and Science Act does is it pours a bunch of money into funding to bring chips manufacturing back to the US for both national and economic security. What it promises to do is to train workforce, which is currently lacking in the semiconductor industry, and through that trained workforce, provide jobs for people in regions where there aren't a lot of opportunities and rebrand economically struggling places. So this idea that instead of being a Rust Belt, he will be something like what President Biden calls the Silicon Heartland. This quote at the bottom, "It's time to bury the Rust Belt and call it the Silicon Heartland," is something that he said at an Intel fabrication facility groundbreaking in Central Ohio 2 years ago. So my research questions with this project. What I'm really interested in is which institutions, policies, and regions are seen as role models. So besides Silicon Valley, which is this very common one that policymakers always turn back to, what other places are looked at and are being replicated? And then I'm really interested in this transfer of these institutions, policies, or regions to Rust Belt places. So how does a policy look when you try to take somewhere like Silicon Valley and implement it elsewhere? So second, what I'm really interested in is how do so-called Rust Belt regions deal with the innovation imperative that I mentioned earlier? And how do they deal with associated microchip policy strategies? So how exactly is the US Chips and Science Act being implemented in Rust Belt areas? Through this course, I'm really interested in how policymakers justify microchip industrialization at a regional and national scale, and how regions react to that type of justification. And finally, in thinking about futuring and promises, what type of future does innovation policy promise to Rust Belt regions? And next to that, what kind of future do these regions imagine for themselves? So these are the questions I've focused on mostly in my research. And I wanted to bring you to my theoretical approach because in the beginning, I said very shortly that I'm coming from the field of science technology studies, STS. STS is a very niche field. It's kind of a conglomeration of anthropology, sociology, philosophy, but also a lot of people come from engineering or physics backgrounds. And what we like to do is understand larger ethical, social, political, and legal dimensions of science and technology. So looking at science and technology from a social science perspective, as opposed to a purely technical or purely natural science perspective. At the Technical University of Munich, I'm in the STS department, and I am in the Innovation Society and Public Policy group. So what we do within our group is we look at the social, political, and ethical consequences of today's innovation-driven societies, and we look at that both at the level of public policy and concrete technologies. So while I study it at the level of public policy, someone next to me might be studying quantum technology and how exactly that technology works and interacts with society. Finally, I'll bring you to my conceptual part. I use the concept of sociotechnical imaginaries, which was coined by Sheila Jasanoff and Sa-Yoon Kim in 2015. So what sociotechnical imaginaries does is help me determine these future visions of social and technological order and illustrate how when innovation models are implemented in different contexts, they're co-produced with locally specific social deficits and acceptable solutions. So sociotechnical imaginaries is my main concept that I use to look at policy narratives next to local visions and how those interact with each other. So coming to my methodology, I'm doing qualitative research. I'm doing a multi-case study. I have 3 cases in my work: upstate New York, where I focus on 2 cities, Utica and Albany, New York; Central Ohio, where I focus also on 2 cities, Columbus and New Albany; and Flanders, which is a region in Belgium where I focus mostly on the city of Leuven. I'm actually from upstate New York, and this is where my research began. So when I started with this idea of looking at left behind places, lost regions of innovation, I felt very connected to looking at my hometown and looking at the cities there because I grew up in one of these post-industrial areas. And I thought it was really interesting to look there. This is where I'm from, just by the way. And what I discovered was that it's not quite as lost as I thought. So although it kind of looks like this Rust Belt area, there is a lot of investment happening. And I'll bring you more to that in my findings. So what I've done in my research, I've been working on this for 3 years now. So I'm in the last year of my PhD. I've conducted 60 interviews with various stakeholders. That includes people who work at the university in upstate New York. That's the State University of New York Polytechnic. Those who work in the industry in upstate New York, those who are reporting on the semiconductor industry, so journalists, and some local policymakers and activists. In Ohio, I focus also on policymakers and activists, a few people at Ohio State University and some people working in the industry. And in Flanders, I've had contact mostly with people working at imec, which is the biggest R&D hub in Europe, semiconductor R&D hub, and a bit with some regional policymakers who work also with imec. What I've done, because I'm mostly focused on the US and the bulk of my research is in New York and in the United States, as you can see, 2 of 3 of my cases are in the US, I look at the White House press releases. So this includes anything from, in case you missed it, updates, fact sheets, but mostly it includes speeches from President Joe Biden. And what I found really interesting here was being able to track the discourse over time and looking at all of the different ways in which he refers to the Chips and Science Act or semiconductor manufacturing within the US. I've also looked at national and regional news media, not nearly as consistently as I look at the White House press releases, because they're mostly reporting on these statements. But I found them really interesting to see how different regions will report differently from national news on what's happening in those areas. I've done a lot of site visits, so I've spent in the last 3 years, I would say, a total of a year over time in upstate New York doing research there. I got to spend some time in central Ohio, and I've been to Flanders 3 years in a row to attend Innovation Technology Flanders, which is a semiconductor conference bringing together industry from all over the world to talk about the semiconductor industry. And I've gone to a few semiconductor events as well, including CHIPS updates online that take place in the US, including Semicon, which took place in Munich last year, which was really interesting, and some other smaller events around regional innovation or microchip policy. So that's my methodology. And now I'm going to bring you to my analysis and how I use MAXQDA for this. So I mostly look at interviews on MAXQDA. It has been the most helpful tool for me in trying to code my interviews and understand them. And I thought it was really cool. This tool I really like just for my own visualization to include in my presentations. This is a document portrait. So I've covered the name, but it shows you how when you go through an interview, you'll have the conversation take different directions. And some of this is based on the questions I ask, but it's also based on what's important to someone, what they continue to come back to. Sorry. So I wanted to explain a bit how I do my coding. I have sets of codes for each case study. And if you're familiar with MAXQDA, you know in the bottom left corner, you have your codes, and then under it, you have your sets. And each set contains codes that are very specific to each case study. So I have an upstate New York set, an Ohio set, and a Belgium set. Some codes cross between the sets. So if they're industry specific, it won't necessarily matter which place they're in. And for those, I have another set, and that's industry. So usually I do my coding, I do a first round of coding in which I pick out parent codes. And these are major themes of my research. This might be something like prosperity, innovation, models, the semiconductor industry, or the future. And then within each of my parent codes, I have maximum 10 subcodes. As you can see on the right here in my picture, jobs, for example, is one of my parent codes. Local labor is one of my subcodes. Work from home is one of my subcodes. At the top, you see all of them, all of the parent codes are in capital letters. So lost is a parent code, and then all the ones above it are some of my subcodes. Mostly I've done inductive coding. So that means that instead of having a pre-selected set of codes that I'm working from, my codes come from the data itself. We work in STS a lot more with grounded theory. So we don't have models that we work from. We work with the data, and what the data brings out is what we come up with to explain our questions. Occasionally I do in vivo coding, trying to see if I have an example of that here. I think there is nothing for you here is a direct quote from one of my interviewees. So this would be an example of in vivo when you have a direct quote and you take that as a code. Yeah, so as I said, interviews will typically span many codes. As you see, there's a lot here that I've coded, but usually they'll have some main takeaways. So you might see that black is a pretty large portion of this interview. That means that people were talking a lot about the idea of a lost region, some subpoints within that idea of a lost region, and they kept coming back to it. And then other things are much smaller. So thinking about the technology corridor in upstate New York, that had played a very small role in this interview. It really didn't come to the surface. Thinking about SUNY Poly's vision, that's the green one, only one or two very small references to it. So you see that some themes take up more space than others. So I'm going to bring you to my findings. So there's key differences in the discourse among interviewees at the local level and policymakers who are more at the national and regional level. So I've used word clouds and code clouds. I find them really useful. I use them also in my master's thesis. Now I'm using them in my PhD. And that shows me how priorities between what my interviewers are saying and what the White House press releases are saying are almost inverse. So there's very different priorities within these conversations and within this discourse. For example, I used a code cloud for upstate New York, which is about 30 interviews. And what I found in my code cloud is that you see lost is huge. So this idea of a lost region was really the biggest part of any conversation. You see that development, regional, jobs, models, these are all about the same. So they also talk about what's happening in upstate New York, So regional foci are very much on like what makes upstate New York a region, what kind of cuts across, what are the similarities between the place. Jobs is thinking about workforce, thinking about either, job opportunities, but mostly in those conversations, people were talking about lack of jobs. And then models, what models are being implemented in the region. And then, of course, semiconductor industry and the university and semiconductor industry research there played quite a big role because that's a lot of what's happening in the region. Meanwhile, in the word cloud, you notice kind of a stark difference. So technology is really coming to the forefront. Chips, semiconductor technology, manufacturing and jobs are quite big. What's really small here and what I find really interesting is talking about communities. Talking about future, talking about workers. So it was very much focusing on these big messaging, big messaging within policy, and very much not focusing on, the same things as here, not focusing on the idea that this is a lost region, not focusing on some of the things within there, which is feeling futureless, feeling like there's nothing for you here. So those are my comparisons. And what I've drawn from this is that, I've already said all this, but I'll repeat it. Interviewees in upstate New York focus much more on the idea of a region being lost. They focus on there being nothing for them there. There's a lack of jobs. They're thinking about themes like revitalization, and they're less likely to speak extensively on the semiconductor industry development in upstate New York related to technology or semiconductor research and development. Meanwhile, the press releases from the White House are focused much more on chips, semiconductor technology, research and development, manufacturing, and jobs. So like I said before, not much on regions, revitalization, or communities. My second set of findings, what I find really interesting is that Rust Belt identity, in this sense, it's coming from, but it's also stabilized by this diagnosis of innovation deficits. So by telling a place that it doesn't have enough innovation, then places start to believe that they don't have enough innovation. So Rust Belt identities, so the people who live there, and the struggles that they have are co-produced with innovation and economic theories. What this means, very simply put, is that this idea that a Rust Belt has no future sticks because it's co-constructed with the idea that an innovation economy is the future. So this is very bright and this is very glitzy. And then you put it next to a post-industrial place, and that post-industrial place feels like it's not worth living. So what I'm coming away with is that the way that innovation policy is understood by people in Rust Belt regions reflects that there's deeper negotiations about value and about identity that are deeply rooted in industrial decline. So legacies there really matter. So interestingly, I've analyzed sentiments with some of my codes, and I really like this tool for MAXQDA because it shows you the way that people respond to questions. So I have different questions in my interviews, and most of those are kind of reflected by major themes because people will answer. And lost, this is asking about the idea of a lost region. Most of the answers were negative or slightly negative. So here's how you do it, and here's my answers. So kind of just skimming through these, you see that people were either negative about the region itself, or they were negative about the idea that the region was lost. In both ways, that creates a negative feeling. So they were feeling like the fact that the region is post-industrial, it's left behind, that's a negative feeling, but also the fact that policymakers say that it's left behind produces a negative feeling as well. Okay. So to my third block of findings, the actors that I interviewed, the stakeholders, they're very aware that delivering on innovation promises is uncertain. So upstate New Yorkers have been told since the 1980s that investing in this idea of a tech valley in the region is going to solve all of their problems. They will have jobs, they will have livable cities, they will have futures, they will have a better economy. And what's happening is, as long as these promises aren't coming to fruition, existing social issues are also not being addressed. So what happens is that people start to become skeptical. Their identities of being from a Rust Belt region are reinforced. And the people in places that this policy is supposed to help are actually being left behind even more. So I've had a lot of fun the last few weeks looking through my data again. And I used a new tool that I've never been able to use before with my data because I didn't have the updated version of MAXQDA. So that's MAXQDA 24. And I got to use the AI assist tool. And I just wanted to see what it could do for me. And what I found really interesting is that it picked out some of the exact same coded segments and came to the same conclusions as I did in seconds. So they have this feature where you can chat with your data. And it's like, okay, if I could ask my data a question, what would it be? And I call my interviews I. So here I asked, how does this person seem to feel about the semiconductor industry in upstate New York? And based on the passage, they've picked out all of the places that I've coded. So, saying that it's not environmentally friendly, it's not well integrated into the community, high-tech jobs are not a good fit for the local population, skeptical that the industry is going to live up to the promises of bringing jobs and prosperity, that it's more of an elite top-down initiative, and it's not well connected to benefiting the local community. And then following up on that, I wanted to know, okay, so based on these thoughts, what does the interviewee think policymakers should be doing instead? They've provided me a pretty short list, and I'll just read you the summary. The idea that policymakers should take a more holistic, community-focused approach that addresses practical needs and challenges facing the local population, rather than pursuing high-tech initiatives that may not directly benefit the region's most vulnerable residents, which is very similar to the conclusions I came to from looking through my 30+ interviews in that region. So I'm going to bring you to some of my conclusions. I'm seeing that I only have a few minutes left. That's good. So as I said, very simply put, policymakers and interviewees don't see eye to eye on the correct way forward for Rust Belt regions, or the best way forward, maybe better put. The idea to build a microchip innovation hub to revitalize the region of upstate New York, it's not being taken up by the locals. And what I mean by that is that they're not fully on board with this idea. They don't feel included in it. They don't feel engaged, and they definitely don't feel like it's for them, even though policymakers have said that repeatedly. So what MAXQDA has helped me do is highlight these differences and priorities and foci within discourse across multiple data sources. So across my interviews, across my news media, across the White House press releases. Yeah, those are my conclusions, and it's been really helpful for me to see, sometimes just to, reinstate that these findings that I have, they are there in the data. So even to see that within an interview, looking at the document portrait, that what comes up the most and what my interviewees feel is most important to talk about is the way the region feels. So is the fact that it's a Rust Belt region, is the fact that they feel left behind, not that they're so excited about semiconductor policy. So yeah. Now I'm going to come to my reflections and lessons learned. So when I started to work on this presentation, I realized that it had been a while since I had updated my data. I mean, I just did field work in May, so I had to integrate all of that field work. And as I was doing that, I came across some interviews that weren't coded, some literature that hadn't made it into MAXQDA. So what I would encourage everyone here to take away from this is that new patterns and codes are always emerging. It's really important to keep the data updated and upload all the data, not just interviews. I've recently started putting in everything that I include in any of my dissertation. Although I originally used this mostly just for interviews, I'm putting all of my literature, all of my policy documents, just so I can see those patterns that emerge across them. My other recommendation is to code very frequently and reflexively. So not only coding an interview once, but going back and looking at it 2-3 times and thinking about, not what's changed in the interview, because nothing will change there, but what has changed in my findings of other things that is making this point in the interview more interesting. So my lessons learned. I think there's so much to learn about the new features of MAXQDA, especially the new version. I'm just starting to dive into the AI tools that are available to us. The transcription is fantastic. The AI assist is phenomenal. I think that there's so much for me to learn there, and I'm excited to use it some more, see how it can save me time and how it can make me engage with my data in a bit of a different way that I haven't before. And I just wanted to point out that I am a qualitative researcher, and there are so many quantitative tools within the program that I think could be really useful. I'm just not a skilled quantitative researcher, and I don't know how to use them. But I am curious if anyone here is watching and has advice for what tools could be useful and interesting for me, please tell me. Yeah, so I'm going to cut it off because I've reached my 25 minutes that I promised. Thank you so much for being here and for listening, and I hope you enjoyed it. I look forward to your questions.